Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ford Presidential Library. My name is Elaine Didier, and I have the pleasure of serving as the director of the library here in Ann Arbor and also the museum in Grand Rapids. We are delighted that you are here for the second program of our winter series, and we are especially delighted you are here on a day like today. You are brave Ann Arbor souls, and I am very proud of you. Tonight's program is brought to you with support from the National Archives and Records Administration, our parent organization, in outstanding partnership with the Ford Presidential Foundation, and it's an honor for us to have Joe Calvaruso, the executive director of the foundation, with us tonight. So Joe, say hello to Ann Arbor. And he gets special points because he came to us from a meeting at Albion College all day, and he has to drive back home near Kalamazoo tonight. So I think he deserves extra cookies before he goes. We're grateful to all of you who are members of Friends of Ford and contributors to the foundation, because it is your support which makes possible programs like tonight's. Tonight we are being filmed by U of M Michigan Media, and we would ask that when we get to the Q&A, the question and answer period after the program, you please go to the microphone at the rear of the center aisle so that everyone watching it later on cable can hear your question. Tonight we have the distinct honor of hosting Peter Baker, an accomplished journalist and author who will discuss his new book, Days of Fire, Bush and Cheney in the White House. As you might guess, Mr. Baker has been in great demand recently and has been featured across the country on television news shows of every network and cable channel, including Colbert. He has spoken at the LBJ Library, the Clinton School, Southern Methodist University, and is just back from a road trip to Harvard, Duke, and the New York University Club. So it's about time you put a first-class university environment on your agenda. The library was fortunate to have Mr. Baker here in March of 2009 discussing the first 100 days of the Obama administration. Now, think about it. That's pretty impressive when you realize that at that point, President Obama had only been in office for 49 days. Peter's very good. He is currently the chief White House correspondent for the New York Times and a contributing editor for the New York Times Magazine. He has covered the administrations of 3 presidents. For 20 years, he was at the Washington Post covering the presidencies of Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. And now at the New York Times, he is responsible for covering President Obama and his administration. Peter won the Gerald Ford Journalism Award for Distinguished Reporting on the Presidency for his coverage of President Bush, and received the Aldo Beckman Memorial Award for coverage of President Obama. Peter is a prior author of the New York Times bestseller, The Breach, which is about the Clinton impeachment, and with his wife, Susan Glasser of the Washington Post, he is co-author of Kremlin Rising, which is about Vladimir Putin's Russia. And it might be a good time to take a look at that book if you haven't. Peter's newest book has received high praise from multiple eminent historians, journalists, and book reviewers, and I will quote just from a few. Days of Fire is steeped in facts, and the writing is clear and crisp. It's an ambitious, engrossing, and often disturbing study, a superbly researched, masterful account. Peter Baker tells the story of Bush and Cheney with the precision of a crack reporter and the eye and ear of a novelist. And finally, it's a magisterial study of the way Bush and Cheney influenced each other, waxing and then waning. High praise indeed. Please join me in welcoming Peter Baker back to the Ford Presidential Library.
Oh gosh, thank you all for coming. My gosh, it is a testament to Michigan that nothing stops you. It's really amazing. In Washington, if we had the kind of snow that you had today, this would be empty. And we would be home for at least 3 or 4 days trying to figure out what to do with the kids. So I'm really, I'm thrilled that you're here. I'm thrilled to be here myself. It's a great treat to be back here 4 years later. One of the great highlights of my career, actually, I consider receiving the Ford Award. It means an awful lot to those of us who actually cover the White House. There are very few awards actually are specifically devoted to the kind of thing that we do every day covering presidents, and the Ford Prize is one that's cherished by everybody who has received it. I want to thank Elaine and Joe especially, and Kate, where she is, and everybody here at the library for putting this together. I'm making it a mission, if I can, to get to all the libraries at some point, but this is definitely my favorite. So just don't tell the Bush people. It's a great honor to talk about this book, because one of the first questions I often get is, why would you want to write this book? Why do you want to write a book about somebody who has been president in relatively modern times? We think we know the story. What else is there to say about somebody that's so prominent already in our public consciousness? And the reason that I wanted to do it was because you discover how much we actually don't really know about our presidents and our vice presidents. How much we really only begin to skim the surface of what's really going on in any time in the moment when a White House is going on. So, in doing this book, I discover and reinforce the idea that I think that reporters get maybe 15, 20% of what's really happening in any White House at any given time. And it's only afterwards when we have a chance to go back and interview people after the fact, to look at documents eventually, to reconstruct what happened, to go through all the memoirs that have been written, that you begin to put together a fuller, more complete and more revealing picture. And the thing that really struck me about the Bush-Cheney years was how much more complex and interesting and dramatic they were than even we thought. These are very consequential moments, right? These were 8 years of Days of Fire. That's the conceit of the book. The title, Day of Fire. Days of Fire comes from the president's second inaugural address. He used that phrase, Day of Fire, to refer to 9/11. The book, in effect, makes the case that this was 8 years of crises confronting the nation and confronting our leaders, not just terrorism, but war, economic collapse, natural disaster, and so on. And so, this is a time period we're going to be looking back and studying and re-examining for years and decades to come. And so you try to pull back the layers a little bit to look a little deeper, and what you discover is a more dramatic and interesting story than I think we had realized. And the book follows these 8 years through the narrative of these two men, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, and their unique and fascinating partnership. Now, what do we know about this partnership, right? We all think we have a pretty strong impression of it. This is, one is a puppet master, the other is a puppet, right? One is the strong-willed vice president, the other is the inexperienced president who's just simply, doing what he's told. In fact, that caricature is never true. And in fact, the story, as you go back and reconstruct it, turns out to be far more Shakespearean, in fact, than we ever really understood. It's an easy caricature. It's a great Saturday Night Live skit. It's the fodder for 100 Colbert jokes on any given night. But it's not the full story of what really happened in those 8 years. Vice President Cheney, of course, was no doubt the most influential vice president we've ever had. Now, in some ways, that's not saying very much. The history of vice presidents is kind of a sorry one, right? Gerald Ford famously has told his people, including Dick Cheney, who remembered it vividly, that the 8 months he served as vice president were the worst 8 months of his life. Hated the job. It really wasn't until Walter Mondale that we even let a vice president into the White House. He was the first one to have an office in the West Wing. Harry Truman only met with, he wasn't vice president for very long, but he only met with FDR twice when he was vice president. Well, Dick Cheney rewrote the book. When he came in, he was going to have a different understanding, as he put it. And in fact, he was asked one time in 2002 about this Truman experience, and the reporter asked him, well, how often have you met with President Bush? And he pulls out his schedule card, and he looks at it, he says, well, see, 2, 3, 4, 5, 7 times, he says, and then he pauses, today. It was a different type of vice presidency. He had rewritten the history. And nobody knew that history better than Dick Cheney, because in fact, he had seen it up close. Here, as we talk about President Ford here in Ann Arbor, he had been chief of staff, of course, to President Ford. And he knew that from that experience that it was a cruddy job. That was the phrase he used with me in an interview. Being vice president is a cruddy job. And he knows because he made it cruddy for several vice presidents, right? Nelson Rockefeller was not a big fan of Dick Cheney's. And Cheney, as chief of staff, considered it his duty to block Rockefeller and some of what he thought were overly liberal policies, and ultimately helped ease him off the ticket in 1976. Rockefeller considered him a phrase that's not usable on cable television. And in fact, again, in the Bush 43 administration, Dick Cheney, as Secretary of Defense, tried to block Dan Quayle from participating in some of the decisions that they made, arguing he was not part of the chain of command. That's not what a vice president was supposed to do. The Secretary of Defense was in the chain of command and not the vice president. So he understood that to be a meaningful job, he had to have a different understanding of it. And you know what? That was fine with George W. Bush. I think what people begin to misunderstand is they think, aha, Dick Cheney somehow took over a presidency. That's not the case. George W. Bush wanted somebody like Dick Cheney at his side. He understood his experience as governor in Texas left some areas where he wasn't as strong, and he wanted somebody like Dick Cheney at his side to help him out. He empowered him, in fact, to do things that previous vice presidents had not been able to do. And why was that? Because, in fact, they had a different dynamic. Vice President Cheney was the first vice president in modern times not to want to run for president. That completely changes that dynamic. Think about that. Like, I think Charles Dawes back in the 20s was the last vice president, sitting vice president, who didn't ultimately try to run for president. And that's because Cheney had already decided he didn't want to do the job. He thought about it at one point, had no ambition to run for president. And that allows a president to trust a vice president in a different way. The normal dynamic is more like Clinton and Gore, where you have these two ambitious politicians. Often they're rivals. Both of them think they ought to be the guy sitting in the Oval Office. And that creates obvious stress, right? It's sort of like California. It's all sunny on the surface, but beneath the ground, there's kind of these tectonic plates kind of grinding up against each other. That didn't happen with President Bush and Vice President Cheney, because in fact, Vice President Cheney didn't want the job. So Bush felt enabled to empower him in a way that previous vice presidents hadn't been. Cheney uses to great effect. In the early days, he certainly knew how to wield power. He knew how to influence decisions. He managed to outmaneuver his rivals at times, like Condoleezza Rice and Colin Powell. But in fact, even in those early days, Bush was the one still making the decisions. Contrary to, again, sort of the mythology, Cheney didn't always get what he wanted in those early days. He wanted to bomb, for instance, Iraq in the summer of 2002, about 8 months before we actually ended up going to war, because there was intelligence showing there was a chemical weapons producing camp in northern Iraq run by a man named Ayman al-Zarqawi. You may remember Zarqawi's name. He later becomes head of al-Qaeda in Iraq and caused this great damage there. And Cheney and Rumsfeld pushed the president to go ahead and bomb it in the summer of 2002. President Bush said no, he didn't want to do that. He wanted to take a more deliberate approach toward the confrontation he was launching against Saddam Hussein. He wanted to go to the UN against Cheney's advice. And so even though he eventually ended up in the same place that the vice president was, they had disagreements along the way. So I think that, I interviewed Dick Myers, who was the general who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and he says that what people don't understand is that Bush was the alpha male in the White House. In any of the meetings, he was the one running the show. He was the one asking the questions. He was the one calling on people. Cheney often actually, in fact, said very little, didn't actually talk in these meetings, contrary, again, to, I think, what we would imagine. The difference was that aides would then walk out of the meeting not quite sure where Cheney stood on an issue, but they noticed that he stayed behind, and that's how he wielded his influence. He was the last man in the room, the only man to be there with the president at the end of the day, in ways we don't necessarily completely know how that interacted. To give you an example, the best example, of course, is March 2003. They've had the confrontation with Iraq. They've gone to the UN. The UN won't give permission or won't give its endorsement of a military attack, but the president has decided to go forward anyway, and he's issued an ultimatum to Saddam Hussein to leave the country or face an invasion. In March 19th, Don Rumsfeld and George Tenet come to the White House, and they say, there's intelligence showing where we think Saddam Hussein is. We could go ahead and launch a strike right now and get him and possibly put an end to the war in a very early way. The president gathers his team around him in the Oval Office and they discuss this. What should we do? Should we go ahead and do this ahead of plan? Should we move up our plans and try to launch the attack that might change things early on? Everybody gives their advice, and finally the president kicks everybody else out of the room. The last person he wants to talk to is Vice President Cheney. So it's just the two of them alone in the room when he finally makes that decision, comes out of that room and says, okay, go. And that's the beginning of the Iraq War. But this changes over time. What's fascinating is this is not a static relationship. It's a relationship that evolves, that in fact grows more distant over time. And the best example of that is to flash forward 4 years to 2007. In 2007, the very similar type of situation in the sense that Israeli intelligence comes to Washington. They say, we've got information that Syria has a nuclear power plant. And this is connected to a weapons program, we think, and we think you should bomb it. Once again, the president gathers his team together. He asks their advice. But this time, he asked Cheney to give his advice in front of everybody else. The vice president said, I think you should bomb the plant. We have drawn red lines in the sand on proliferation. If we don't, we won't follow through on it. We won't have any credibility. I think you should do it. And this time, the president says, okay, who here agrees with the vice president? And no hands go up. And then and there, the vice president is forced to confront his isolation in front of everybody else. What a change from 4 years earlier. So what changes? Well, you know, I think as President Bush enters his second term, he begins looking for a different way to approach his presidency. He begins to find a new path forward. Iraq has gone badly. There hasn't been the weapons that he had been told and he told us were going to be there. And he's looking for a way to recalibrate heading into his second term. He elevates Condoleezza Rice, his national security advisor, to be Secretary of State, to become, in effect, a counterweight to Cheney on a lot of the big issues that they confront. He begins moving more toward diplomacy on a lot of the big issues around the world, Iran, North Korea, Syria, and so on. He begins to compromise on some of the big counterterrorism policies that are so controversial from the first term. Surveillance. He goes to Congress and gets a bipartisan endorsement of what had been secret warrantless surveillance. He goes to Congress and gets approval of new detention rules. He begins to move prisoners out of Guantanamo in order to move toward the eventual day where he might be able to close it. In fact, he actually moved more prisoners out of Guantanamo than President Obama has in the 5 years since then. Now, President Obama was left with the hardest cases. It's not that they're easy. But President Bush was, in fact, moving toward the same goal that President Obama has laid out. President Bush closed the secret CIA prisons overseas and brought those prisoners in. There was no waterboarding after 2003. He was beginning to move in a different direction. And Vice President Cheney saw this as a disturbing trend. He thought this was moving away from the principles that the two of them shared and that the country might be in danger as a result. And he began fighting back, quietly, in the privacy of the White House. But time after time, the two of them found themselves on opposite sides of many issues. In fact, by the time they left office, they were on the opposite sides of almost every major issue that was confronting the White House. On the opposite sides, not just of Syria and Iran and North Korea, but on Middle East peace, on Russia, on Lebanon, on climate change, on gay rights, gun rights, on the auto bailout, on Harriet Miers, on Donald Rumsfeld, and eventually on whether to give a pardon to Scooter Libby, the Vice President's Chief of Staff. Now, this is a rather dramatic change over time from the most influential Vice President that we had ever seen. And, I asked Vice President Cheney about it during one of our interviews, and he says, well, eventually I think the president didn't need me as much. He had his own judgments, he had his own feet planted, and he didn't need staff as much, which I thought was actually very telling because he used the word staff to describe himself as well as others. Now, President Bush would say he didn't really change course, but that he did in fact feel that he wanted to put his program on a more sustainable basis for when he left office. By compromising on some of these things, by trying to find some sort of consensus on them, he could leave office having left a program to a successor, Democrat or Republican, that wouldn't be reversed the minute he left office. And that's kind of what happened. President Obama ran against Bush's first term, but inherited Bush's second term. And by that I mean, in effect, the compromises that have been put in place by the time President Obama takes office mean that he doesn't, in fact, throw everything out. He makes some further modifications, he makes some changes, but as we see with the NSA debate we've been having these last few months, he keeps a lot of the architecture of national security that he's been left behind by President Bush. Now, you know, President Bush and Vice President Cheney are left with these sort of, you know, years of tension beneath the surface. And they all finally come to a head in the last days of the administration. Frustrated by all the different ways that he has lost on major issues, Vice President Cheney comes to President Bush with one final request. He wants a pardon, as we talked about a second ago, for Scooter Libby. Now, Scooter Libby, of course, was his chief of staff and national security advisor, very important advisor to Vice President Cheney, arguably Cheney's Cheney, as some put it, and he had been convicted in the CIA leak case. Now, he wasn't convicted of the leak itself, nobody actually ever was, but he was convicted of perjury and obstruction of justice for not telling the truth about how he had learned that Valerie Wilson was affiliated with the CIA. Cheney thought it was a bogus prosecution. He thought it was political. He thought the prosecutor was out after him, and that Libby had taken the bullet, in effect, for him. And he told Bush that this shouldn't be allowed to stand, that Libby should be pardoned as they're getting ready to walk out the door. Well, now, Bush is very skeptical. He doesn't like pardons to begin with. He's never really been very interested in giving pardons. He thinks it's a screwed up system in which people with special access get special exceptions. He's given fewer pardons, in fact, than any president in a century other than his father. He's learned the lessons of what happened with his father, who gave last-minute pardons walking out the door, and President Clinton, who gave last-minute pardons walking out the door. President Clinton's were especially controversial for Mark Rich and some of these other folks who ended up being so hotly disputed. And so Bush was inclined not to do it in the first place. But he sends his lawyers out to go relook at the case. He says, you know, go through the transcripts, find out whether or not a pardon might be justified. And they do. And they also meet with Scooter Libby in a seafood restaurant near the White House. And they talk with him about it. And they come back to the White House and they come back to the president and they say, well, we think the jury was justified. We think they had every reason to find what they found. And Bush says, fine, okay, no pardon. And he has the most difficult lunch he's had in the 8 years with Vice President Cheney, and he tells him no pardon. And Cheney lashes out at him and says, you're leaving a good man wounded on the field of battle, which is a really harsh thing in the Bush world because it attacks the very thing that Bush values most, his own sense of loyalty to his people. And it's a cutting comment, and it's something that begins, and it really gnaws at him. It really bugs him. Cheney has been after him and after him and after him for weeks. He thought he had finally made a decision, and yet he couldn't quite put it behind him, which is unusual for Bush, right? He's the decider, memorably, right? We heard him describe himself that way, and he famously didn't second-guess decisions once he had made them, but this one he did. He goes to Camp David for his final weekend of his presidency. It's supposed to be kind of a celebration or at least a commemoration with family and friends. 8 years of extraordinary times. They want to, you know, mark the occasion. In fact, Bush is so tired at this point. He's been through so many different things. Just a couple weeks earlier, he had been at the White House having a Medal of Freedom ceremony, and one of the people he awarded a medal to was Morgan Freeman, the actor. And President Bush recalled that Morgan Freeman had played a president in a movie before, a movie called, oh no, I'm blanking on the movie. The one where the comet hits the planet and destroys all civilization. And Bush kind of ad-libs at this point. He says, that's about the only thing that hadn't happened in the last 8 years. He's tired, he's done, he wants to go home, he's ready to go back to Texas. And yet here he is, his final weekend, and he's dwelling on his fight with his vice president. And he calls his old aide, Dan Bartlett, back in Texas and says, this is just really consuming me. And Bartlett says, you need to stop letting it haunt you like this. And Condoleezza Rice is up at Camp David, and she pulls him aside into another room and says, you can't let this be a pall over your last days. Finally, Laura Bush says to him, you know, basically, you know, you have to make a decision. You're ruining this for all of us. and he basically decides, okay, he's gonna stick to his decision, no pardon. He goes back to the White House. 2 days later, it's Inauguration Day. Barack Obama, the newly elected president, comes to the White House for the traditional coffee between incoming and outgoing presidents. And the two of them then get in the car together to head to the Capitol for the ceremony. And it's just the two of them in the back seat, other than the Secret Service in the front, and they're heading a mile up Pennsylvania Avenue. And President Bush, 8 years of days of fire, offers one last piece of advice to his successor. He says, whatever you do, set a pardon policy early and stick to it. In other words, learn how to say no to your vice president. There he is, literally in the last minutes of his presidency, with all the things that they had gone through. What's on his mind is this unpleasant end to the partnership that he had forged with Vice President Cheney. Well, what happens then? We all know, of course, the two of them go their separate ways. President Bush goes back to Texas. He's done with politics. He wants nothing to do with it anymore. That's the swamp, he says. You're not going to pull me back into that swamp. I'm done. A couple of years ago, he had a dinner party for some friends in Dallas, and he told them, he said, when I saw Obama's hand go up over that Bible, I thought to myself, free at last, free at last. But Vice President Cheney was free at last too, right? He was no longer the subordinate. He no longer had to be deferential to the boss. And as a free actor out in the world again, he became a very tough critic of President Obama. Very vocal, he began talking about how he thought that President Obama's policies were endangering the country. He was particularly upset at the idea of reinvestigating some of the CIA officers who had been involved in interrogations. But what's interesting about that was Vice President Cheney's public battle with Obama seemed kind of like a proxy for his private battle he'd had with Bush. The issues that had upset him so much in those last few years, finally he could give vent to in a public way with a Democrat as the target rather than his president, the Republican, but the issues were the same. Finally he was telling us what he really thought. So where are they today? What are their relationships? Well, President Bush was asked about this actually on Air Force One a few weeks ago when he traveled down with President Obama to Mandela's funeral. And he was asked, how often do you see Vice President Cheney? He says, never. And he's asked about some new book that has the two of them on the cover together. And he says, I don't understand why he's on the cover. He says, he's just one of many advisors I had. The telling moment comes in the last April when President Bush opens his own presidential library. He's down in Texas, down in Dallas at SMU. And he has a very nice ceremony and a beautiful day. The vice president is there. And President Bush says nice things about him from the podium, as he's, of course, wont to do. But it was very clear, but it was kind of telling that Condoleezza Rice was on stage and had a speaking role. Vice President Cheney was in the audience sitting with the kids and the cabinet secretaries. And if you went into the library afterwards and you looked around at how the museum part, you looked at how President Bush wanted his presidency to be remembered, right? Because this is before they turned it over to the archives. This is how a president conceives of his legacy, in effect. You see exhibits on Iraq, on his freedom agenda. You see an exhibit on PEPFAR, his AIDS program. You see a beautiful portrait of Laura Bush. You see pictures of the daughters. There are videos hosted by Condoleezza Rice and Josh Bolton and Andy Card. There's even statues of the dogs. What there isn't is Dick Cheney. He's nowhere to be found in the museum. This is how far the two had traveled over 8 years, which I think is very telling and very interesting. And I think it's a relationship that we will look at as a model and as a fodder for study for many years to come. So I think with that, why don't we can open it up for questions, and we can talk about Bush and Cheney. We can talk about Russia and Ukraine if you want, right? And President Obama or anything else that might suit your fancy. So.
Definitely appreciated and enjoyed the book. The research was impressive. I enjoyed sitting in on all the meetings, thanks to your details of that. Certainly, it says much for your reputation that you had so many principals willing to be interviewed by you. I'm intrigued with both Cheney's maneuvering, as I'll call it, and if you could expand on it a little bit, both to be the running mate the first time and how you say he eliminated others so that he was the only logical choice left. And in the second term, he got Bush to commit to him a little sooner maybe than he wanted. But the thing that surprised me the most is that Bush didn't know about Cheney's conservative voting record, as you mentioned. And did Bush not really care that much, thinking, okay, I want to balance the ticket with experience? And did no advisors, campaign advisors, come to Bush and say, hey, here's what may happen, here's how you may lose the middle, because unlike the second term, they weren't focusing just on the base. You may lose the middle with this guy. Did nobody sound an alarm at all in that situation?
Those are good questions. Thank you very much. Good questions. It's interesting because I think that, we often think of Cheney as somebody who changed, or at least that's the common conversation, right? Gosh, he used to be a moderate and he really became more conservative over time. And that's really not the case. If you spend any time here at the Ford Library, for instance, you look at his experience as chief of staff, he's been conservative, I think, from the beginning, very consistent. He was, in fact, at odds with Nelson Rockefeller, as we talked about, with Henry Kissinger, wasn't a big fan of détente. He thought that Ford ought to put Reagan on the ticket in 1976 after they beat him for the nomination. Bob Hartman, who was Ford's close aide at one point, wrote that he considered Cheney somewhat to the right of Ford, Rumsfeld, or for that matter, Genghis Khan. So, Cheney, and Cheney was consistent. As a member of Congress, he had a very conservative voting record. One time, in fact, the Washington Post, my newspaper, my old newspaper, referred to him as a moderate Republican, and he called his press secretary and told the press secretary to call for a correction. He's in the 41 administration. He was the doubter of Gorbachev and believed that they should still be aggressive and assertive with the dying Soviet Union. I think what confuses a lot of us is that he has a very low-key demeanor, right? He was very good on Meet the Press. He was not a bombastic type. He might have Newt Gingrich's voting record. He did not have Newt Gingrich's style. He was very agreeable with Democrats who he disagreed with. And he, therefore, I think people were confused to think of him as a moderate because he worked for moderate presidents like Ford and Bush 41. Colin Powell's theory of the case is that in those previous administrations, he had people around him who were checks, in effect. They were more of a balance, In Bush 41, for instance, there was Brent Scowcroft and James Baker and President Bush himself, who were more moderate than Vice President Cheney. And therefore, people didn't understand quite how conservative he really was. When he's interviewing with President Bush, or talking to President Bush about President Bush 43, Governor Bush then at the time, about joining his ticket, he gives reasons why he might be a problem for Governor Bush. And one of the things he says is, I'm very conservative. And Bush brushes him off. He says, yeah, Dick, we know that. And Cheney says, no, I'm very conservative. Did anybody mention that? Well, Karl Rove actually opposed Dick Cheney being on the ticket, which is kind of interesting, right? And in fact, Bush says to Karl Rove, fine, come tell me why you think Cheney shouldn't be on the ticket. And he brings Karl into the library of the governor's mansion in Austin and says, okay, sit down and tell me why. But Karl can't help but notice that over Bush's shoulder, when he is supposed to give the reasons why Cheney shouldn't be on the ticket, is sitting Dick Cheney. And he has to give this presentation in front of the guy he's arguing against, which is not an easy thing to do. So, I think that they didn't see that, obviously Governor Bush didn't see that as a negative. I think Governor Bush was more inclined to agree with Vice President Cheney on a lot of these issues. I don't think they were as far apart as that. One reason why Cheney had more influence was because in some ways he was pushing on an open door. I asked around, I did 400 interviews, about 275 people, with everybody basically except for President Bush. And not one of them has said that Bush ever told them, Cheney made me do it. Bush does not go around saying to people, Cheney convinced me to do something I was not inclined to do. Bush was more conservative than his father, and more in tune, in fact, with Cheney's philosophy than people might have realized. And I think that's what changes over time. I think over those 8 years, they begin to diverge on a lot of those issues. And so they didn't foresee what you're saying. Real quickly, you mentioned the story of the reelect. Vice President Cheney did go to President Bush and offer to drop off the ticket in 2004. He said, if you want to get rid of me, no problem. No hard feelings, it would be no problem. And President Bush gives him some thought. He spends a few weeks thinking about it. He even comes up with a successor, Bill Frist, senator from Tennessee. And ultimately he decides not to. But I thought what was very interesting was the reason he gave for why he thought about it. He says it would show who's really in charge. And that tells you how much it was beginning to get to him by that point in the presidency, that people thought that Cheney might be the one in charge and not him. It was really beginning to eat away at him. And in fact, at a number of points over the presidency, he brings this up with guests and visitors to the White House who don't mention it, saying, you know, I'm really the guy in charge here. I don't even agree with Cheney half the time. So it really begins to gnaw away at him, I think, over time. It's a long answer, sorry.
First of all, thank you for coming. The presentation was wonderful. I really enjoyed it. My question to you is, you know, when we look at the George W. Bush presidency, most voters, most intellects, most people will look at the foreign policy aspect of his presidency, obviously Iraq and Afghanistan. But what I think a lot of people forget is George Bush initially had a domestic agenda that he wanted to try to implement and pass, whether it be tax cuts or whether it be the No Child Left Behind Act. My question is a two-part question, if I may. The first part is, what sort of influence did Vice President Cheney have on the domestic policies that George W. Bush wanted to implement? And the second question is, of the policies that W. Bush wasn't able to pass, like Social Security privatization or even illegal immigration, which is something we face today, why do you think he wasn't able to pass those? Why couldn't he get Congress behind it?
Right. That's a great question. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. You're right. President Bush came into office expecting to be a domestic president, right? He had 6 years as governor of Texas. He knew issues like that, and that's where he was most comfortable: education, taxes, economics, and so on. And he did have a lot of things that he did pass in the first term that were pretty important. Had it not been for 9/11, had it not been for Iraq, those would be the things we would be debating today, right? Was No Child Left Behind a good thing? What about the tax cuts? And Medicare Part D, which he expands Medicare to cover prescription drugs. Those are all big things. Cheney, for the most part, didn't play a big role in those parts. He played it on the tax cuts. That's something he did care about. He didn't care about stem cells, for instance. He didn't play a role in that decision. He didn't really much play a role in No Child Left Behind. As he said, look, he knows a lot more about education than I do. He doesn't need my advice on that. So other than economics, he didn't play on the domestic side very much. Sometimes to the annoyance of the president. When Katrina happens, he asked the vice president to head a task force to handle recovery, and the vice president tells him no. He says, well, I think it's going to be a paper tiger. I won't have any real authority. I'd just as soon not do it. He husbanded his energies for the issues he cared most about, which tended to be national security. Aides would come to him and say, well, gosh, sir, we're really upset about this environmental thing or this economic thing or this domestic thing. And he'd say, look, if you guys want to go fight it out in the staff meetings, fine. But I'm not going to use my energy for it, just so you know. So he really, having said that, he did have that impact because that staff of his was pretty assertive and did play a big role in some issues even that he himself was not necessarily all that interested in. And because they came from his office, they had a little extra juice, and people assumed the vice president was more interested than he was. So you mentioned Social Security immigration. Why did they happen? I think that was very simple because of Iraq. I think Iraq took all the oxygen out of the air by the 5th and 6th years of President Bush's administration, and there was no interest in helping him on domestic policies when Iraq was just hovering over everything. Karl Rove would tell you they made a mistake by going for Social Security first rather than immigration out of the box after re-election. That had they gone for immigration first, they might have had a better chance of getting that because there was a bipartisan potential there, right? Democrats agreed with him to a large extent on what he wanted to do with immigration. It was conservatives in his own party who were mainly opposed. And Social Security was more polarizing as an issue. But that may be, but by his second term, his domestic policy was largely done. He couldn't get those two things through. He couldn't get tax reform through. And ultimately, he basically puts them aside so that he can focus on fixing Iraq with the surge. Yes, sir.
Two questions. One very quickly. In the course of the 8 years, was there ever a possible bombing campaign against anybody, any foreign country or group that Cheney did not advocate? I mean that seriously, but, and the second question would be this, that I've always been puzzled by Cheney making statements like, if there's a 1% chance that something will come and repeat 9/11, then we have to just throw billions of dollars or more into it. And yet we have this problem that maybe it's only a 1% chance that global warming will exterminate human life. And there seems to be no, and I think it's higher than that myself, but there seems to be no comparable concern with something that may not have 99% probability.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's very, very good questions. On the first, Cheney is a funnier guy than people often realize, and he had a pretty wry sense of his own perception, how people saw him. His friend David Hume Kennerly, also a friend of the people here in this room, once asked him, came into a room one morning and said, "Hey Dick, you bombed any small countries this morning?" And Cheney, without missing a beat, says, "Yeah, that's one of the things I love about this job." You're right, he was on the more muscular side of most of those debates. If there was a question of should we use military force, he was more likely to say yes. Obviously, the Syria example we just talked about is one where he advocated it and lost. He was certainly more willing to at least think about it with Iran. And even with Russia, there was a discussion in 2008 during the Georgia War about whether or not there should be some sort of involvement in trying to protect Georgia. Now we're talking about things like giving stingers to the Georgians or putting some peacekeepers on the ground to try to deter the Russians, or possibly there's some loose discussion about bombing the Roki Tunnel. The Roki Tunnel is the main corridor that Russians took into Georgia. And Condi Rice was quite upset about this. She said there's a lot of what she called chest thumping in these meetings about what they should do. And it came to Steve Hadley, her successor as National Security Advisor, to kind of put it on the table. And in a meeting with the president, he says, "Okay, I want to ask, does anybody in this room think we actually ought to use force and go to, and possibly go to war with Russia?" And the president's kind of confused. He doesn't understand why Hadley's doing this. He thinks this is kind of a ridiculous question. But Hadley goes around the room and makes everybody basically say, no, we think it's not a good idea. Even the vice president says, no, I don't think that's a good idea. And the point is, and Bush gets it at this point, is Hadley trying to put everybody on the record. All right, I don't want anybody writing memoirs later saying I advocated a stronger response and the president didn't do it. He wanted to confront their bluff, in effect. Are you really willing to go to war with Russia? Because that's what possibly could happen if we did some of these things. And everybody in the room, including Cheney, finally says no. So these questions did come up a lot. He did tend to be on one side of those issues, no question about it. Your second question on the climate change is a good one. I can't really answer on his thinking about climate change in general. Obviously, he was an oil man. He had a point of view from that. His thinking on the 1% thing, to understand it a little better, is to remember that he spent the 80s doing these continuity of government exercises. And he was a member of Congress at the time. Once a year, they would snatch him up and a few other people and take him off to some mountain retreat somewhere and pretend the world had ended, in effect, right? We'd had a nuclear war, and how do you reconstitute a government? And he played the chief of staff of the White House in these exercises. So literally every year, he was, in his mind, confronted with this possibility of the absolute worst possible outcome out there. So when 9/11 comes along, even before that, he's been thinking about this. 9/11 is the manifestation of some of the worst fears he had ever had. And in fact, he thought it was going to be much worse than that. He thought that 9/11 was really only a tiny fraction of what the real threat was. Now, we can say he was wrong. We can say he estimated that threat. It looks different today than it did then. But I think to understand, you do have to remember what it was like in that moment in the White House. And at that moment in the White House, one friend of Bush told me, look, don't just focus on 9/11. Focus on the anthrax attacks to understand why they took some of the actions they did. And if you remember, we didn't know at the time the anthrax was a domestic thing. We thought this was a foreign power sending us death in white powder in the mail, right? And they were also getting these other reports every day. There was a botulinum attack at the White House, so they were told at one point. At one point, literally, the president and the vice president are told, you've been infected with botulinum and you're going to die a terrible death. Turned out not to be true. But they went through this period of waiting for the test to come back with the mice to see if the mice died or not. They were told about the Pakistani nuclear scientists who had been meeting with Osama bin Laden. They were told about threat after threat. Think about this. The intelligence agencies, having failed to connect the dots, right, before 9/11, were throwing everything they had at the White House. Literally everything. Things that were rational and things that were completely fanciful. And of course, that impacts your thinking about the threat that's out there. And Cheney was convinced that the threat out there was not just 19 guys with box cutters, but a much worse possible outcome. And in that context, to him, his rationale is, what is the trade-off of waterboarding 3 guys, right? Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the other 2 guys they waterboarded, versus the possibility of Charlotte, South Carolina disappearing in a puff of smoke. Now, again, we can question that judgment, but that's what he was thinking. And I asked him about this during one of our interviews. I said, okay, I understand your rationale with regard to the issues of torture and interrogation and so forth. But even if you felt intellectually it was the right thing, was there any part of you that had felt a little queasy about it, right? Because I think a lot of these decisions are hard. You know, the decisions the presidents and vice presidents make are not usually 90-10. They're usually 51-49, 60-40, what have you. They're trade-offs. And it may be the right thing to do something, but part of you might feel like, gosh, I don't want to be the person who had, you know, if you had to send somebody to war, it may be the right thing, but I would hate myself personally to feel responsible for that. And Cheney says no. He says it was absolutely the right thing to do. He had no sense of regret or queasiness whatsoever. And it's that certitude that powered his political career, and for good or bad. And I think that's interesting. It remains to this day. He's very convinced that they did the right thing. So, sorry.
Thank you for your talk. I have a question. You alluded to this a little bit in the question and answer so far about Karl Rove, and I think the narratives that sort of permeate what we think about the Bush presidency include him just as much as Cheney. I'm wondering if you can take a few moments to talk to us about Karl Rove's relationship with the two together and then individually, and how, you know, as you talk about President Bush's sort of, I'm the one who makes the decisions approach, how Karl Rove fits into that triangle there.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Karl's role as a campaign architect is obviously unparalleled. Once he gets into the White House, obviously, you know, he's a pretty dominant force when it comes to domestic policy and to domestic politics, which are never completely separate in this White House or any White House. But when 9/11 happens, he's less of a figure. I mean, he doesn't play on the national security front nearly as much. He wants to make the case to the country that the president's been strong in national security in a political sense, but he's not in the room for a lot of the big decisions that are made on national security. He and Cheney sort of had this, what one friend described as sort of a tacit understanding, that they sort of kept their separate spheres, right? Rove did the politics, Cheney did national security, and they wouldn't, like, you know, get in the middle of each other. They actually clashed, or at least were tense with each other at one point in the 2004 re-elect, when at Karl Rove's recommendation, the president endorses a constitutional amendment banning same-sex marriage. Cheney doesn't like this idea. His daughter, of course, as we know, is gay, and he actually opposes this amendment. And he's mad at Rove, according to friends, for injecting this into the campaign. And in fact, causes a great rupture in his own family at the time. Mary Cheney hears what's going to be in the State of the Union and rushes to the White House, very upset, not sure she can work on the campaign this year for a president who's going to support something like this. And Cheney's wife, Lynn, shows up, Cheney's other daughter, Liz, shows up, and they have a family crisis meeting. What do we do? Mary, are you going to quit? They tell her, Mary, if you want to quit, we'll understand. You know, it becomes a big thing in their family. And we obviously have seen since then the tension, obviously, that was happening in the family that we didn't even know about at the time between Liz and Mary. So Cheney blamed that on Rove, and they had sort of a wary, kind of mostly respectful, but kind of wary and distant relationship. As for the president, I think that there was this sort of, I think President Bush valued Rove's advice, thought he was very smart, sometimes thought he got big for his britches. He referred to him as Turd Blossom, that was his official nickname. From time to time would kind of put him in his place if he thought Rove was getting, too much of the spotlight. But I think largely thought that Karl was an important part of his team, and he gave him great latitude when it came to the two elections.
Thanks for coming, and I enjoy seeing you on PBS, Gwen Eifel's show. My question has to do with the upcoming 2014 elections and 2016, and whether or not we'll see Bush on the trail, and sort of how, if no, in 2016, what's it like for him to have to sit out 3 presidential elections, and also does Cheney will he ever campaign for Republicans, or what's his role in elections?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think President Bush, I think he's genuinely not as interested in politics as he once was. They had a dinner party in fact, that Karl Rove was at in Dallas after the presidency, and Rove was sitting there regaling the table with his assessment of the midterm chances in 2010. And Bush couldn't have been interested less. He just wasn't paying attention. He just started talking to his friend's wife, who was sitting to his right, and completely ignoring Rove on this. Now, is he completely removed from it? No. He gave money this year to Lindsey Graham, who faces a Tea Party challenger. He's privately given advice. He talked to Chris Christie when Chris Christie was thinking about running for president in 2012. And he's talked to Mitch Daniels, one of his former aides, about the same thing. So behind the scenes, he from time to time will give advice. But I don't think he wants to be out there publicly. I don't think he's going to campaign in a public way. I think he feels like he's done with that. And Cheney, I think Cheney would. I'm not sure that many people want him to, you know. I mean, the ones who need him probably don't really need him, right? You know. And there's this really interesting disparity between Bush-Cheney conservatism and Tea Party conservatism, right? To the extent that incumbents might want a conservative validator like a Cheney, it may not be helpful with the Tea Party as much, because the Tea Party has its origins in its rejection of Bush. Bush has he's not a small government conservative, he's a big government conservative. He creates the DHS, he expands Medicare, he expands the federal role in education through No Child Left Behind. These are all, he favors immigration reform. These are all things that are anathema to a large extent to the Tea Party. And the Tea Party's rejection of Obama had its roots, I think, in its rejection of some of the things that Bush had done. In fact, Bush, I think, today sits at home and he's worried about the Tea Party. That's one of the things that does trouble him, both for its domestic policies, but really because of its foreign policies, because it's so isolationist in comparison to his sort of assertive internationalism. So I don't think you'll see either of them on the campaign trail very much. I think, you know, clearly Cheney will speak out from time to time. I think he'll probably give interviews in which he'll say things, but I don't know that you'll see campaigning. Thanks.
If you had the opportunity, what advice would you give Obama on how to deal with Syria? And follow on to that, what advice do you think Bush would give Obama if he had that opportunity?
That's a good question. I'm going to completely punt on the first one. I'm not even going to pretend, because I don't want to insult your intelligence by pretending to. It's really not my job to give advice, and you know what? I really don't want to, because I think there's no good advice on something like that. It's a terrible situation. President Obama, you know, understands the terrible situation. If there was an easy solution, they would have taken it. And obviously, he's sort of his own ambivalence and uncertainty is played out in a public way. Last fall was obviously, you know, his own uncertainty about what to do with the chemical weapons attack and whether to have a strike or not. And I'm going to have Congress decide. You know, whatever side you might be on in that debate, he seemed to be all over the place and didn't really bring the country behind him. So I think he had a rotten experience with that at the time. Vladimir Putin ironically saved him by coming along and saying, hey, we're going to have this deal to get rid of Syria's chemical weapons, the same weapons that Syria denied having and that Putin denied them having just a few days earlier. But today that program is somewhat behind. You know, they've missed some deadlines, only a certain fraction of the chemical weapons have been removed, and that doesn't get at the larger question of the civil war that's now caused 140,000 deaths. So what would Bush's advice to him be? That's a really interesting question. Bush, as we said, was very reluctant to use force in the second term. You know, having gone through with Iraq what he had gone through, at every opportunity where people came to him and said, here's an opportunity to use force, he said no, including against Syria. So what would he advise Obama? I think he would advise Obama to be a little bit more decisive than he's been, and to be, you know, more clear-cut about what American interests are there. And if there are going to be American interests, what are we going to do about it? President Obama's problem in part had been setting a red line that he hadn't really thought through what would happen if we crossed it, right? Because of course a guy like Assad is going to cross that. And but President Bush was very allergic to new military adventures in his second term. You know, like for instance, at various points people talked about whether to use helicopters to try to help the people in Darfur who were being, you know, slaughtered by the Janjaweed. And President Bush was inclined to help. He really personally felt quite upset about what was happening in Darfur, but ultimately rejected it because it's just, we can't have one more war in another Muslim country. And I think, he confronted, in a way, the same issue that Obama confronts today, which is, the idea that, how many of these things can we get involved in? And I don't know, it's a really good question. I'd love to ask him that, what he thinks the president ought to do in Syria right now. Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask you, so I apologize. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I'd like you to comment on the relationships of Colin Powell and the Defense Secretary.
Rumsfeld, yeah?
Yeah, Rumsfeld. They seem to be pawns in that relationship between Bush and Cheney that you talked about. Powell having come from Bush 41 and Rumsfeld having been one of Cheney's first mentors.
Right.
They seem to get, it seems to me they got caught up in that relationship between those two. And I'd like to hear some
That's a
some
great
comments.
question. Now, for anybody who didn't hear, it's about the Powell-Rumsfeld relationship and how that related to the Bush and Cheney tension. And it's a good question. I think that Powell was brought into the administration because he was the most popular Republican in the country, even more so than the new president, right? And so Bush 43 understood that he had to have Powell, he wanted to have Powell on the inside. He wanted his credibility, he wanted his stature, he wanted his, the reassurance to the country. He had basically offered him Secretary of State even before the election as a signal to the country, look who I'm going to have at my side. You can feel comfortable even though I don't know anything about national security because I have Colin Powell, I have Dick Cheney. But Powell's announcement, when they just announced he would be Secretary of State, Powell gives a statement as part of this. And it's sort of this bravura, tour of the horizon around the world in which everybody kind of was saying, well, gosh, he looks more presidential than the president. And in the back of the room, the president's guys are like, this isn't good. We don't like this. And that's where Rumsfeld comes from. Because in fact, they began thinking, how do we find somebody who can counterbalance Powell? The first person they were thinking about for defense secretary was a senator named Dan Coates. But both Bush and Cheney interviewed him and thought, wasn't going to be strong enough to be a counterbalance to Powell. And so Rumsfeld is picked ultimately because they did feel like he was a forceful enough personality to counterbalance Powell. And then they spend the next 4 years fighting, the two of them, again and again and again, they and their people, constant sort of knife fighting in the classic Washington sense, leaking and using proxies. And Rumsfeld is very close to Cheney, and is his second in effect, trying to box out Powell. And Powell feels kept out of the loop at times on when the president decides to renounce the Kyoto Treaty and get rid of his, and his promise to cut back on carbon emissions, his campaign promise. Cheney gets him to do it without Powell even knowing about it. Powell gets a frantic phone call from Condoleezza Rice saying, hey, the president's just signed this letter, he's going to send it to the Hill, saying no way with Kyoto and we're going to renounce the campaign promise. And Powell says, well, stop it, I'm heading there right now. And he runs to his car and he races over to the White House. And by the time he gets there, he goes in the Oval Office to protest, and they say, sorry, it's too late, it's already gone. And essentially the same thing happens with the detention rules after 9/11 when Cheney shows up at the White House, in the Oval Office with a new order that the president can sign creating military commissions and basically disregarding Geneva. Powell again is left on the sidelines. So, Powell was frustrated any number of times. Dick Armitage, who was his deputy, actually advised him to quit at one point, which I don't think people really knew, saying they're just using you as cover to do things that you don't want them to do. And Powell said no, he wouldn't do it. He was a good soldier, he viewed himself as a good soldier. But interestingly, I think he gets credit for a position he never actually took. People see Powell as somebody who actually tried to stop the war. Well, not really. He actually tried to use more, he pushed Bush to do more diplomacy. He wanted there to be more coalition partners. He wanted him to take more time. He wanted there to be a second UN resolution if there could be. But when push came to shove, he didn't say to Bush, don't do it. Bush comes to him and finally says, I think I've decided to do it, Colin. Are you with me or not? And Powell says, yes, sir, I'm with you. And he had a chance to say, no, don't do it, and he didn't do that. He gave him warnings. He said, here are all the consequences if you do it. But he didn't say, don't do it. So, it was interesting. When Powell did turn in his resignation at the end of the first term, he asked Andy Card, the chief of staff, he says, is Don going too? And Card said no. And he said, well, I think, if you're going to really do this, you have to have a clean slate, and he should go too, because, it's just too toxic. And that was one decision Bush couldn't make, and that was partly because Cheney was such a strong backer of Rumsfeld. So Rumsfeld sticks around 2 more years, in part because of that. So.
Follow up to that, and it's about suppression of dissent against the Iraq War. So there might have been dissent within the administration, and you might talk about misinformation that had to do with what Colin Powell was saying at the United Nations, and also suppression of public dissent, that it was difficult for the news media to find, the public outcry against the beginning of the war.
Well, it's a great question. I appreciate that. I would say on the part of the news media at that time, I would say, first of all, I was out of the country, so I wasn't part of covering that. It was in actually the Middle East, waiting for the Iraq War to get started. I was in Kuwait, and I actually spent about a month in Saddam's Iraq, hanging out with inspectors and so on. So I don't have as good an understanding of what happened domestically with the media at that time. But obviously, the New York Times gets blamed for producing stories that were wrong about the intelligence, about what was in Saddam's Iraq. I mean, the editors of the paper have admitted that, and they've said that we should have done a better job of questioning our sources and being more skeptical. I think to understand it, not to excuse it, to understand it is, reporters are to some extent hostages of sources, because we don't have subpoena power, we don't have spy satellites, we don't have the tools that a government has to discover information, and so a lot of the information we try to get is from government sources, and if the government sources are wrong, or if they mislead, it's a challenge for reporters to figure that out. There were some reporters who were more skeptical than others, and their stories should have gotten bigger play. There were dissents within the intelligence community, particularly on the nuclear part of the discussion, and those should have been highlighted further than they were. Having said that, the nuclear part was always the sketchiest part, and then the biological part to some extent too. But the chemical part, pretty much everybody thought was true. There wasn't a lot of disagreement about that inside the intelligence community. Because he had it before and he'd used it before, so who was to think he had gotten rid of it? And I think that sort of shaped a lot of the conversation and shaped a lot of the coverage. And I think we live with that legacy today, the media and the country and the government. If Iran is really pursuing nuclear weapons, why should we trust that? We were wrong before. How should we think this is right? Similar with Syria, the chemical weapons attack that was made in Syria. There were people out there who were very dubious about it because it felt like, gosh, here we are again. We're trying to gin up a war with the Middle East over over weapons of mass destruction. Now, in that case, they were actually used, as opposed to what happened in Iraq, which in 2002 there was nobody obviously using them. But that's the legacy that we live with today. That's a legacy of doubt, of skepticism, and uncertainty, and finding the right balance between being appropriately skeptical and not refighting the battles of the past, I think is a challenge for the whole politics and media in Washington. So I don't know that we found that right balance, but I think we're trying. So, one last question? Sorry.
You started your talk talking about the office of the vice presidency and how, for 200 years the vice president was usually and almost always a weak position. We've only had one vice president since Dick Cheney left, but can you see a legacy from Dick Cheney's term as a vice president in Joe Biden's term?
Yeah, that's a great question. I do think so, yes. Now, I remember interviewing Joe Biden right before they took office in 2009, and I have to say it was probably the first vice president in history who ever promised to be less influential than his predecessor. But he was, of course, trying to make a point, right? I'm not going to be Dick Cheney. But the truth is, I think Cheney raised the bar for everybody who will follow. It won't be the same, Biden is not the same as Cheney, and Biden's successor probably won't be the same either. But I think Biden is probably more at least has been at times anyway, more central to this administration than, say, Gore or Mondale or certainly Nelson Rockefeller or Dan Quayle were, right? So I think the bar has been raised. Biden was central to a lot of the first-term priorities. He was in charge of managing the stimulus program, of managing the withdrawal from Iraq. And he did a number of the deals with Congress when they finally did do some deals on budgets and so forth. Having said that, we again seem to be in a second term where a vice president doesn't seem to be quite as influential, and I'm not quite as sure why. But we haven't seen Biden as much in the last year or so. He was given gun control to do, which didn't work. And he didn't play much in the fall on some of the big issues that confronted the White House. He wasn't there in a public big way on Syria, on the healthcare website being such a debacle, on the government shutdown. Harry Reid, the Senate leader, said, I don't want Biden to be part of it this time. We think he gave away too much last time, so stay away. And so Biden was kind of sidelined. Lately, he was given the job of doing a study reviewing job training programs. So, you know, he may be running for president. We're not sure. Obviously, he says he might. Maybe he wants to keep a lower profile to be, you know, careful. Or maybe, again, we have a president who wasn't very experienced when he came in Washington, who feels more sure of himself and doesn't need the more experienced second guy as he did in his first term. I think we're going to probably see some books a few years from now that help us unravel that. Thank you very much for coming. This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Peter. You disappeared. We have a special president. Well, first of all, he was just as nuanced and thoughtful as he was before, which is why we invited him back. But there are two new biographies of President Ford, one in his youth and one by the Jim Cannon publication last year. And so we have a box set of these for you,
great.
so
Thank
that
you.
in future you can come and do more research at the Ford Library.
That's great.
And you'll have a starting point about President Ford. So
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That's fabulous. Thank you very much.
fantastic.
I appreciate it. This is just what I would like. Good. Wanna sit down?